Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Staci. It's near end of May now, middle end of May, and we're getting into June. And even though it's not technically summer yet, it kind of really feels that way. And I'm not a big fan of summer. I like spring, and I like early spring when it's like not cold, but still cool, and I just need like a light jacket, and there's a nice cool breeze. And then as spring goes on, I hate it even more because it's like there's only like 3 weeks of nice spring weather, and then we start getting into like, I'm just gonna call it pre-summer. It's not summer and it's not spring, it's like pre-summer, like pre-kindergarten, pre-summer. And where I live, it's regularly triple-digit degrees for a good portion of summer, especially in the later parts. But I think where I live, we can get there in like June. I hate summer. But beyond the triple degree weather, I also don't really care for summer because of the whole, oh, it's bikini body season or it's bathing suit season. And I'm just like, no. A, it's too hot. Can't I just stay inside where it's air conditioned? But B, what does that mean even? A bikini body or a bathing suit body. I'm a female, so it's usually called bikini body. I did love a year or two ago where people, took to social media to say, a bikini body is a body in a bikini. And you saw women of all sizes just wearing bikinis. I mean, like, this is a bikini body because I'm in a bikini. I'm like, good for you. Bravo for you. Yes, why should we have this really small notion of what a bikini body is? But on the other hand, while I don't agree with, working out just to get a quote unquote bikini body, you probably do want to work out to maintain your health. And amongst that would be a healthy weight. But it's probably a bit confusing for a lot of people. What does that mean? What is a healthy weight? How do you determine that? What factors go into determining whether or not my weight is healthy? And without having to go to specialists, how should I myself know if I'm starting a new diet or exercise regimen or just making some lifestyle changes if I want to get to a so-called healthy weight? How will I know when I'm there? How will I measure that? So that's sort of what the episode today is about. I've titled it, What Should You Really Weigh? But of course we don't like that should word, but that's how it's often talked about. This is the range that you should be in to be healthy. And if you're above this range, you're overweight. And if you're above that range, you're obese, etc., etc. So there are many ways that quote unquote healthy weights are determined, different systems, I guess you would say, that different medical professionals use. And we're going to talk a bit about that today. So your weight, there's a number of things that can go in and determine your weight. Your age, your muscle fat ratio, your height, your sex, and your bone density. So, when people say, oh, they're just thick boned or big boned, they might actually be telling the truth that people do have different bone densities. Some people have thicker and or more denser bones than others, and that, of course, can show up on the number on the scale. So what's ideal for one person might not be ideal for another, and probably is not ideal for very many people around you, just because of all those factors that have to be taken into consideration. That's what's ideal for me. Even if I were to, take all the people in my so-called demographic of all the people of my age or my gender or what have you, it would still probably be very different just between us because there's multiple factors that go into this. So it used to be evidently long time ago, this was considered old school, but I had actually never heard of this before, that the way they very simply computed how much you should weigh was to start at 100 pounds and then add 5 pounds for every inch after 5 feet. So for that example, a person who's 5'4" should then weigh around 120 pounds. Okay. I know several people around 5'4", but I don't know too many that actually were 120. And I'm trying to think of, I'm not sure I know too many people just in general who are around 120. That's an interesting number. And again, old school. The one that I heard quite a bit, including in high school, which I absolutely hated, and that you've probably heard of quite a bit too, is the BMI. So BMI, I believe, stands for Body Mass Index. And it's kind of, the numbers are often tried to correlate with body fat, but they're not exactly the same. It also doesn't take into account things like waist, chest, or hip measurements or bone density. So it's just your weight by your height. But you can, and you'll see this a lot if you've followed, sort of Fitspo people on Tumblr and Instagram, where they'll post pictures of themselves where they weigh the same, or they actually weigh less in the before picture and more in the after picture, but the after picture is very clearly the fitter one, because the before one, it was like, okay, you don't weigh a lot, but you don't really have muscle density, you're not really exercising, you're not really eating healthy. And then when you do start doing all those things, you gain more muscle, and you always hear that old adage of muscle weighs more than fat, so your weight goes up. And according to the BMI, then maybe you might, before where you were healthy, suddenly be considered overweight, but you're actually healthier with the added weight, and the BMI does not take that into consideration. So a lot of health experts actually criticize the BMI for use in individuals, which did not stop it from being used pretty much all my time in PE. We all had to calculate our BMI and look at where we were. And that was one of the things we had to keep track of, along with, the pull-up test and the push-up test and the mile test and all of those I hated. That was a once monthly thing. And I just was like, this is the worst day of the month. Seriously, what? Or is this day over yet? Can we just skip this day every month? Whatever this random day is, this third, Thursday of the month or whatever. Let's not do this anymore, please. Because for me, it was very strange where, according to my BMI, I was overweight in high school. But my friends would have a BMI that said they were healthier. And yet my friends would actually have a larger clothing size than I would. And it was just like, I don't quite know how to take this. Because if you just looked at us, you wouldn't necessarily think my friend was the healthier one. But according to the BMI, they are. So, The BMI evidently was actually originally meant to just sort of track populations as a whole, not for individuals. It can be used to sort of see population variations and domestic standards like that, but to do it for individuals in healthcare, it shouldn't really be used for that. It actually tends to underestimate the amount of body fat, particularly in overweight, obese people, and overestimate it in leaner, muscular people, so that it's just giving you a wrong number in so many cases. I'd actually like to know, listeners, if you ever found the BMI to be useful, please let us know on social media, because I don't know that I've ever met anyone who found their BMI and was like, you know what? That feels right with all the things I'm doing in my life, that I am around that level of healthiness. Yes. So, We're going to take a short break. Stay tuned.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast. Before the break, we were talking about the BMI and how many, perhaps even most health experts are in agreement that the BMI should not be used to evaluate whether an individual is healthy or not. But other ways that people have tried to sort of create a very easy way to figure out whether or not you're at a quote unquote healthy weight is one of those is the waist-hip ratio. So you might have heard of this. This sometimes comes up, strangely enough, I've seen it in like analysis of old Hollywood stars. I have no idea why. And that like the quote unquote ideal figure for a woman and what the waist hip ratio is for that and how that actually varies amongst different cultures and actually tends to vary a bit between genders in that women tend to think what an ideal waist-hip ratio is, and a woman is a bit usually smaller than what men tend to view as an ideal waist-hip ratio. But if you don't know what the waist-hip ratio it is, it's almost exactly as it sounds like. You measure the smallest circumference of your waist and divide that by the circumference of your hip, and that gives you the waist-hip ratio. So you should be measuring the smallest circumference at the waist, which is usually above your belly button, and the widest part of your hip. For men, there's sort of different ranges. If your waist-hip ratio is less than 0.9, you are generally believed to have a low risk of cardiovascular health problems. If you're from 0.9 to 0.99, you have a moderate risk of cardiovascular health problems. And if you're 1 or over, you have a high risk of cardiovascular problems. And if you kind of remember back to, just basic math, if your ratio is over 1, waist divided by hip, that means that the measurement of your waist is greater than the measurement of your hip, just so you know. For women, the number is expected to be smaller because women generally, not always, but generally have a larger waist than men, because of the whole thing of evolution and childbirth and what have you. So relatively speaking, their waist can be smaller to their hips. So for women, if your waist-hip ratio is less than 0.8, you have a low risk of cardiovascular health problems. 0.8 to 0.89 is a moderate risk, and 0.9 or over is a high risk of cardiovascular problems. And this is actually somewhat supported by science. Various studies have shown that people with apple-shaped bodies, that is, people who sort of hold the weight around their waist and therefore tend to have larger waist-hip ratios, have higher health risk compared to people with pear-shaped bodies who, because especially in women, the weight is more around the butt and thighs, the waist-hip ratio would be lower. A woman also with a waist-hip ratio of less than 0.8 is generally healthier and more fertile than women with higher waist-hip ratios. That's not I wouldn't necessarily look for a specific causal relationship there, but that's just a correlation that they found. They're also less likely to develop diabetes, most cancers, and cardiovascular disorders. Men with a waist-hip ratio no more than 9 are generally healthier and more fertile as well. But waist-hip ratio, unfortunately, doesn't measure accurately the total body fat percentage or the muscle-to-fat ratio, but it is considered to be a better predictor of health than the BMI. In 2012, Dr. Margaret Ashwell found that the waist-to-height ratio was better at predicting future heart disease and diabetes than BMI. So rather than the waist to hip ratio, this is the waist to your total height. So if you measure around your waist, again, the smallest part, and divide that by your height, so long as they're both in the same inches, so long as they're both in the same units. So in America, we tend to use inches, other places tend to use metrics, but don't, measure your waist in centimeters and then divide it by your height in inches. That will probably really throw your numbers off. So for example, if again, a woman who is 5'4" has a waist circumference of, let's just go with 30, that would be less than half her height because 5'4" is 64 inches. And Dr. Ashwell said that keeping your waist circumference to less than half your height can help increase life expectancy for every person in the world. And this is actually a really simple way to do it. It's possibly the most simple because you most likely know your height already without having to measure it, unless you're of the age where you're still growing, in which case you might want to check on that just before you do anything. Or if you're of the age where you might be shrinking, you might also want to check on that. But for most of us, for a good portion of our life, our height tends to stay the same. So all it would take would just be to measure around your waist with a measuring tape and just make sure that number is less than half your height. There isn't even a specific number that you necessarily have to have. They do, of course, also have their sort of ranges of this is a moderate risk and a obese risk. But Dr. Ashwell simply says less than half. And I'm like, you know what? That is simple enough. I can follow that. So now beyond even just, the whole getting up and weighing yourself in the morning, which I always forget. I put the scale in the kitchen and just, it's in a place, it's near the garage door, and yet somehow I always forget to step on it at the same time every day as you're supposed to. And I'm just like, I have not yet made this habit, and I'm not sure I ever will. But I think it would be very simple to just sort of track my waist measurement. Probably not every day because I'm not sure it would fluctuate that much, but even just to make that like a weekly thing on just Sundays to, measure my waist and be like, okay, I am still where I was last week, but I lost an inch from last month. I'm doing good, that sort of thing. And so long as I'm below half, I'm actually doing pretty awesome. So if you're looking for a simple measure to just sort of track where you are with your weight, that would be good. And I know some of you are probably thinking, but wait, that's not weight at all. That's measurement. Despite what some sort of quote unquote health gurus would try and tell you, you can't really do spot treatments with weight loss. You can possibly grow your muscles, but if you're trying to lose weight, it's very difficult, almost impossible, to specifically lose weight from one part of your body. Your whole body will just sort of lose weight as you go along. And depending on your genetics, you might be more prone to hold weight in certain places. And so that would be the last part to lose weight, but you can't really shrink certain spots. So if you were trying to just sort of shrink your waist, you couldn't do that without losing weight over your whole body in general. So it is sort of a indirect measure of whether or not your weight is in a healthy zone, I guess you could say. But above all, of course, the one that health experts tend to prefer, but at the same time is difficult for the average regular person without going to their doctor's office or a specific clinic to do, is to measure body fat. And because, of course, this is like the waist height ratio being an indirect stand-in for weight, weight is also kind of an indirect measure for body fat. Again, like I mentioned earlier, the Fitspo people where they post the before and afters where their weight's gone up, but they're actually healthier. It doesn't always work. It's not a one-to-one thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that because you've lost weight, you've lost pounds on the scale, that your body fat has also gone down. Those can be correlated, but they're not necessarily always the case. But for most people, the whole thing with BMI, with waist to hip, with waist to height, is trying to get a basic understanding of where your body fat is, especially body fat around the abdomen can be very dangerous. The body fat around the abdomen, visceral fat, can be harmful for the heart, kidneys, and liver, while fat buildup around the hips and bottom is less hazardous to your health. So you do want to try and keep that waist measurement down, because that, even just within fat, the fat around your waist is worse than fat everywhere. So we're going to take another short break, and then when we come back, we will talk about body fat specifically. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast. So now we're on to body fat percentage. So your body fat percentage is the weight of your fat divided by your total weight. And the result indicates your essential fat as well as storage fat. And I had to look this up because I'm like, the what? There's different. I only kind of knew that, having where fat was important and fat around my waist was worse, but there's different types of fat. Okay. So essential fat is the amount of fat we need to survive. Women generally need a higher percentage than men. Essential fat is roughly 10 to 13% in women, where it's only roughly 2 to 5% in men. Storage fat is the fat accumulation in adipose tissue, some of which protects the internal organs in the chest and abdomen. And total body fat is essential fat plus storage fat. So you often have seen this if you ever sort of look up body types or what have you, where it's like overweight and obese and athletic and fit and that whole thing. If you look up body types or body fat percentages and go to images, you can often find these sort of charts, both for men and women, sort of giving you a visual representation of what the various ranges of body fat often look like. So the body fat percentages are divided up by body type. Athletes or athletic for men tend to be between 6 to 13%, and for women between 14 to 20%. You'll notice that percentage is already higher than just the amount of essential fat, because if you only have the essential fat, you're actually underweight and possibly in like a starvation level of your body. You definitely need more than essential fat. Essential fat is sort of like the bare minimum. So even professional athletes have more body fat than the essential fat. Non-athletic but still fit people, for men, the body fat percentage is 14 to 17%, and for women, 21 to 24%. The acceptable, quote unquote, acceptable range for men is 18 to 25%, and for women is 25 to 31%. And then you start getting into the overweight. Overweight for men is 26 to 37% body fat, and for women is 32 to 41% body fat. And then obese in men is 38% or more, and in women is 42% or more. And if you've ever done your BMI, you will see that those numbers, not exactly the same, but are somewhat similar. I believe in the BMI, you start being overweight for women. I don't actually know men because I always paid attention to the women one because I am a woman. You do start being considered overweight once your BMI gets, I believe, to around 31 or 32 or so. So that matches around the 32 to 41% body fat that is overweight. Many experts say that calculating body fat percentage is the best way to gauge fitness level because it is the only measurement that includes the body's true composition. And there are several ways to actually calculate body fat percentage, but none of them really actually give a 100% accurate figure. However, their estimates are all generally considered fairly close or close enough to give you the idea again of your sort of general level of health. So examples of ways that body fat percentage is calculated include near-infrared interactants, dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, and bioelectrical impedance analysis. I cannot remember now what show it was. It was some reality show, but I can't remember what it was, where to measure the body fat percentage, they got into this like egg-looking tub capsule thing. Really hard to explain if you haven't seen it. And it was by, I can't remember if they used water or they used air, but it was by how much you displaced that was sort of calculating your mass. And then from that, because they knew other things about you, they could sort of figure out what your body fat was. Point being that all those ways, again, the scientific ways that I struggled to pronounce properly are obviously not easily available to just the average person looking to get healthier. There is, of course, if you've seen it, the thing with measuring and the caliper, which you sort of measure like the body fat around your waist. Again, the waist fat is very important. And that sort of gives you, again, an estimate of your body fat, but it's not exact. And I would definitely need to like read an instruction manual for that. Cause I'm like, I get that you measure it, but then what do I do with there are some, at home body fat measuring things that you hold and they look a bit, at least some of them do, like the things on gym machines where you would put your hands to see your heart rate. They've got those sort of like metal plates, but you would hold it and it still requires, at least the one I've seen and the one I have at home that I haven't used in forever, that you have to know your height and your weight already. And you have to enter those in and then you hold it in a certain position. And somehow through that, I really can't explain the science of it. It gives you an estimate of what your body fat is using both those numbers, but also whatever information it's getting through these metal hand sensor things. However, again, all of those are sort of, but I'm not sure how exact these numbers are. Body fat percentage, of course, is the preferred way right now for most health experts. It seems, just don't do the BMI. Like if you take away nothing else, BMI, really not useful for individuals. Slightly more useful for like demographic variations, I suppose, if you're doing statistics or what have you. But for yourself individually, just kind of ignore your BMI. Ideally, it would be great if you could do some sort of body fat measurement, but of course, those are not exactly things you can do on your own or might require special equipment and or a visit to a doctor's office or a specialist's office. So in the middle of don't do and kind of hard to do, there are the waist to hip ratio and the waist height ratio. Waist to hip, somewhat okay. Waist to height, also somewhat okay, but at least simpler. Much, much simpler of just keep your waist below half your height. Michal, now you're doing pretty good. But of course, no matter what you weigh, you do want to also keep the regular healthy habits. So if you're not getting the majority of your calories from real food exercising vigorously 3 to 5 days a week, avoiding prolonged periods of sitting, getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep, maintaining strong social relationships, etc. All of the sort of basic healthy things that you always hear about. If you're not doing all of that, irregardless of what you weigh or what intermeasurement thing here says, you could definitely be healthier. You're not fully healthy. So rather than think about what you should or should not weigh, you might want to consider your ideal weight, quote unquote, ideal weight, as the weight you're at when you're doing everything you can to promote good health. The weight you're at when you're ideally as healthy as possible. And on that note, we're going to end for today. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Health and Wellness Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.